Today we're talking about a really important topic, which is about diversity and underrepresented populations and underserved populations. Hi, Beverly. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Good. So I know this is a topic that you're really interested in, that you think a lot about, which is good because it's really important, as I said. I'm wondering, to start off, what is the difference between diversity and also underrepresented or underserved populations?
Well, diversity generally refers to differences. However, all differences don't necessarily qualify as underrepresented or marginalized populations. There are a lot of
Okay.
ways that people are different, and we tend to think of people in dominant positions. If you think about it in terms of ethno-racial identification, um, white people have ethnic differences. They're
Right.
not all the same. However, um, as a group, white Americans are not underrepresented or marginalized. So,
Hmm.
you still want to attend to um, what is culturally relevant to a client.
Sure.
Just because they're white doesn't mean that it explains everything.
Right.
Um, but they're not necessarily politically or socially marginalized in the sense that they're affected by institutional social inequity.
Right. Right.
And that's what I'm considering marginalized. If people are, um, there are social systems that preclude their having equal access to
Hmm.
social opportunity. That's a different kind of problem than just having just being culturally different.
Right.
So one question is whether or not you're dealing not whether or not, because everybody has these differences around gender, ethnicity, sexual
We're
orientation,
all different, right?
socioeconomic. Yeah, all of those things are different, but the degree to which they make a difference often has to do with whether or not those identities are stigmatized and result in social inequity for members of those groups.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so I'm wondering then, why would it be important to know this as a therapist? Why is it important to know this to keep this in the back of our minds as therapists in therapy? This difference.
Well, people who are socially marginalized have different psychological realities and therefore different psychological tasks than folks who are not. Um, if you, let's just say, for example, the state-sponsored violence, which is, the pattern of police assaults on unarmed Black men,
Yeah.
for which they're often not punished. The pattern of racial profiling that is often denied. I can't imagine that one can see a Black male client and fully understand that person and
Hmm.
not understand that every time he gets into his car, whether consciously or unconsciously, he's thinking about, am I going to get stopped by the police and what's going to happen when I do, and how to behave and all of those things.
Right.
Much less if, not if, but when the
Right.
police stop you or harass you. Um, and those are different kinds of challenges. People who live in areas where, because of their race and or socioeconomic status and other things, don't have access to supermarkets or places where they can get fresh, healthy food.
Right.
Um, that matters.
Yeah.
If people are targets, disproportionate targets for either random violence that everyone in some ways is targeted by, but is a disproportionate target for police violence. That's different.
Right.
That's
Yeah.
something that you want to understand how that person understands that, how they negotiate it, how perhaps it's shaped their reality of the world. What
Hmm.
concretely are the things that they have to do to try to keep themselves safe, um, that may or may not be successful, because when you're a victim of social inequity, there is a great deal of that that's outside of your control.
Right. Yeah.
So, just sort of people for whom just following the rules and doing what they're supposed to do doesn't necessarily get them the outcome that it's supposed to.
Sure, yeah. And so to summarize, there's a huge difference between people with social inequity and just, people who are just diverse in whatever way you wanted to define diversity, right? Because with the social inequity, that affects our psychology, right? It affects the way that we interact with others. It affects the way that we feel. It affects the way that we cope with things. It affects all aspects of our lives, right? It's not something that you can kind of separate, right, with the way that we live, right? It's inseparable.
Exactly. And it's important not to mistake appropriate hypervigilance for paranoia.
Yes, yeah, that's an important factor to highlight for sure. Yeah, because
And if one isn't attending to the social inequity and the reality of the person being at higher risk, you might tend to misinterpret the way they move about in the world as being perhaps more vigilant than they should be. But you have to adjust your expectations to what their reality is, and not
exactly.
necessarily the reality of dominant cultural group members.
Exactly. And also similar to the, paranoia or the hypervigilance, but also the anger, right, that people often label,
Absolutely.
minority groups with. Yeah, that anger is also socially an appropriate reaction, right, to the experiences felt, right, by groups who are underserved and underrepresented.
Absolutely. But and even beyond that, what usually happens, anger is not an emotion that people want to have directed at them, but certainly
Sure.
therapists have to be able to tolerate clients' expressions of anger,
Yes.
and even expressions of rage.
Yeah.
But for people who are constantly victims of discrimination, or who have to be vigilant about being victims of discrimination, it's appropriate for them to be angry about being ill-treated,
Right.
and then to
Right.
have their complaints about their ill treatment dismissed as though their reality doesn't matter. That can happen in psychotherapy just as it
Yes.
happens in the social context, where
Right.
a client comes in, they're very upset about having what they experience, perhaps a racist or sexist or heterosexist or even combination thereof encounter, and before appropriately exploring their feelings about it and allowing them to express a good deal of intense emotion about it, the therapist kind of rushes into, well, premature cognitive restructuring. Well, maybe it
Right.
was this, maybe it was that, maybe it was something else, maybe it was exactly what the client experienced.
Yes.
And because it's not a part of the therapist experience, and it seems wildly absurd in 2015, it could get prematurely dismissed.
Yeah.
Or that anger could become pathologized.
And then it becomes invalidating, right? And so the person, feels comfortable enough.
It's a form of silencing.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, people are silenced around their anger and their feelings of appropriate rejection of ill treatment in society, but they should not be silenced about it in therapy.
Yeah.
That should be the safe place where people can express anger about their mistreatment in safety,
Right.
so that anger doesn't, ferment and become rage.
Right. And you're absolutely right. I want to reiterate that the fact that the therapy room should be a therapist that can be re-traumatizing, right? That can add further pain to the clients.
Sure.
Yeah.
And it can certainly undermine the patient's accurate reality testing.
Yeah. Yeah.
That their perception that they're being ill-treated is often true.
Mm-hmm.
And prematurely sort of suggests that other things are going on. Of course, there may be other things going on, but there's always time to explore that when
Sure.
the patient has had time to just cathart and just express whatever intense emotions they have around whatever's going on at that particular time, and not prematurely cut that off.
Right. Yeah. So I'm wondering, what is, in your view, the best way to acknowledge or the best way to address people's marginalization, people's discrimination, people's experiences with being, treated wrongly, the social marginalization? How to best address that in therapy?
Well, I think first it's important for us to ask people how they regard themselves. What do they see as their most salient identities, and what do those identities mean to them?
Okay.
And if you never hear about clients' experience of discrimination, where you'd certainly expect that at some point they would have had to have that experience, we have to be willing to ask, well, were you ever treated badly because you're a member of this group? Were you ever told that there's, something's wrong with being a member of this group or that? Because we know certainly that that's often the case.
Right.
And it can occur in the client's family. It doesn't, unfortunately, have to always reside outside of the family community.
You're definitely right.
And sort of explore what do they see as special challenges that they have around some of these identities, and how do they negotiate them, and where did they learn to do that? Because often people use the skills that they learned from their parents or other family members, and some of those skills are good skills and some of them may not be.
Yeah.
But parents teach their kids what they know. And if what they know has worked for them, it may seem fine, but it also may not be as useful in the current generation as it was in a previous generation.
Sure.
Because the appearance, the way discrimination is packaged changes over time. And so what may have worked in 1940 is not necessarily the best solution in 2015. But it's important to get a sense of, how does this affect this person's life? Because discrimination has a way of exacerbating the routine tasks of life that are already fraught with challenges.
Yeah.
There are challenges in much of what we do in life, but having to manage discrimination on top of that can make a routine challenge something that becomes